It's time. Where the slides are. Jeremiah, do you know where Joel is? Could you grab him? Good morning. Welcome. We are thrilled that you are here for our inaugural session of our Inclusive Excellence Speaker Series, and particularly given the response for this particular topic, we believe we have almost 900 people online who are viewing today's session. So again, really thrilled that you are here. Before I introduce our speaker, I have a couple of pieces that we want to take care of. First of all, our practice is to do a land acknowledgement. So we begin by acknowledging that Washington University in St. Louis is located on the ancestral lands of the Osage Nation, Missouri, Illinois Confederacy, and many other tribes who were removed unjustly, and that we are the beneficiaries of that removal. We honor them as we live, work, and study at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. Before I introduce Professor Brown, I do want to give some thank yous to several individuals who played a key role in making today's program possible. First of all, Joel Dalton, who is our planning and programming manager, and I would say planner extraordinaire. Thank you so much, Joel, for all of your hard work in getting this program together. You probably all know Joel's name by heart now, but given all the email messages. Cheryl Welsh, who is executive assistant in my office, Tona Wilson, who is our content strategist, all helped in terms of getting this program together and making sure that it will be successful. And I also want to thank Joni Westerhouse, who is with WashU Communications and Medicine, because again, that really helped in terms of getting the word out. So Joni, thank you so much for helping us to spread the word. Once we pushed out the communication on Tuesday, within 20 minutes, we were at capacity. So really, again, thrilled with all of that particular work that happened. And I also want to thank Professor Kimberly Norwood, who is a professor in the School of Law and has been a longtime colleague of Professor Brown's, who also helped to spread the word over at the Danforth campus. So again, really thrilled for all of that help in terms of moving this forward. So I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Brown. It's weird for me to call him that because I never have, because he is a friend and colleague from more years than I'm even going to say. I won't even say how many years ago that is. But I do want to give him his props because they are certainly due. So Professor Kevin Brown is the Richard S. Melvin Professor of Law Emeritus at Indiana University Maurer School of Law and the Mitchell Willoughby Distinguished Professor of Advocacy and Public Justice at University of South Carolina School of Law. In 1978, Brown graduated with distinction from the Indiana University School of Business, where he majored in accounting. He graduated from Yale Law School in 1982, and after graduation, he joined the Indianapolis law firm of Baker and Daniels, which is now Fager, Drinkle, Biddle, and Reith, and he was there until 1987. He was an original participant in both the first critical race theory workshop held in Madison, Wisconsin in 1989, as well as the next 4 annual workshops and the first People of Color Conference held in Chicago in 1991. And that obviously is a key reason why I wanted Professor Brown to come here today. As you saw in our notice that went out, we really are trying to bust some of the myths and many of the myths around critical race theory. So I thought it was important for you to hear from an original participant. For over 35 years, his primary research interests are in the areas of race, law, and education, and the global impact of the African American struggle. He has published over 80 articles or comments on issues such as critical race theory, school desegregation, affirmative action, African American immersion schools, increasing school choice, the impact of African Americans on the apartheid struggle in South Africa, and the inspiration the $250 million in India have drawn from African Americans. Carolina Academic Press published his 2005 book, Race, Law, and Education in the Post-Desegregation Era, and his 2014 book, Because of Our Success, The Changing Racial and Ethnic Ancestry of Blacks on Affirmative Action. His chapter entitled The History and Conceptual Elements of Critical Race Theory is the first chapter in the Handbook of Critical Race Theory in Education. And by the way, I will mention we do have an article from Professor Brown. We will be including that along with several other readings and resources that will be available on our website, so we will send you that information as well. Professor Brown teaches torts, law and education, race and law, and transnational inequality on a regular basis, but has also taught law and education, criminal law, sports law, and development. He has been a visiting professor at the University of Texas School of Law, the University of Alabama School of Law, and the University of San Diego School of Law. He has been affiliated with universities on 4 different continents, including the National Law School of India University in Bangalore, India, the India Law Institute in New Delhi, India, the law faculty of the University of Cape Town in Cape Town, South Africa, and the University of Central America in Managua, Nicaragua. He also spent the spring semester of 2014 teaching in the London Law School Consortium program. He is a frequent speaker at scholarly conferences and has spoken on issues of race, education, diversity, or the global impact of African Americans over 300 times, including at the annual convention of the NAACP, the Congressional Black Caucus Brain Trust meetings, the National Bar Association, the National Summit of Black Women Lawyers, the American Bar Association, the Justices of the Indiana Supreme Court, and the High Commission of India in London. He has also been at several institutions presenting on these topics, including Oxford University, the University of Mumbai, Jindal Global Law School, and the School of Oriental and African Studies of the University of London. And now we can add the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. I am happy to welcome my friend and colleague, Kevin Brown. So you'll just advance it and yours will come up next. Okay. That's just a preview.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for being here. And I definitely want to thank my very good friend, Sheree Wilson, for inviting me. Certainly when she called, I said yes right away. We go back a long ways and have fought a lot of battles. Well, as she said, my name is Kevin Brown. And I was a law professor at Indiana University Maurer School of Law for 35 years. Retired this past June and joined the faculty of the University of South Carolina Law School. And yes, I was one of the 23 scholars of color who got together at that original critical race theory meeting. So let me see if I can get this done right. Yeah, I'm trying. Well, let me do it this. Okay, I get back. You can see over here on the right is Richard Delgado. Above him is Derek Bell. There's Mari Matsuda, Kendall Thomas, my classmate from Yale. There's Kimberly Crenshaw. So anyway, there we are. I'm sort of that tall guy in the back with hair. And I can tell you, teaching law school for 35 years, that'll do it to you. Today, I'm going to try to explain critical race theory to you. Now, I could talk about CRT defensively. After all, a number of state legislatures have already banned certain CRT concepts. Indeed, the state of Missouri's legislature is looking at banning at a minimum CRT. But I'm not going to present CRT defensively. I want to make it clear, though, that when I talk about CRT, I am not talking about the way the critics present us, because they are trying to demonize CRT. And I think the purpose of their efforts are directed towards minimizing or preventing public school efforts to teach about racial history and racial oppression of the past, as well as DEI training. It's a part of an anti-democratic effort in our society that is attempting to attenuate our multiracial democracy. And it's also trying to obscure the continued racial inequality that exists in our society. But even though I believe what they're really trying to do is to whitewash history. But even though I'm not going to present it defensively, there is at least one criticism I want to respond to, and this is that criticism that harkens back to the McCarthy era, and that is that we were communist or Marxist. Now, I got to admit, as a law professor, to be called a communist or a Marxist always seems strange to me. I mean, after all, we do teach courses on race discrimination and wealth disparities, but we also teach contracts and wills and trust and civil procedure and the Uniform Commercial Code. In other words, we are very much a part of upholding the social and economic order in the United States, not tearing it down. Thus, let me be clear. We did read Marxist writings, but we also read the writings of other philosophers and political scientists, including John Locke, Catherine McKinnon, Adam Smith, John Rawls, Jeremy Bentham, W.B. Du Bois, Bell Hooks, Cornel West. We read as widely as we possibly could. And we believe in America's economic system. Our goal as law professors in CRT was simply a more equitable distribution of the material resources of American society. So I'm not going to talk about CRT defensively. I'm going to talk about it as someone who was in the room debating these ideas. Now, one of the famous early CRT pieces was written by Maurer Matsuda, and was entitled Looking to the Bottom. Because in CRT, we came to realize that how people understood racial issues depended on their positionality in the racial socioeconomic order, as well as their experiences that they brought to the place that they were at. So in the spirit of CRT, I want to situate myself with you. And I'm doing this Not to toot my own horn, although I am not beyond self-promotion. But I'm doing this to situate myself so you have a better understanding of the experience which I bring to bear to talk about this. Now, at age 66, I know I'm coming to the end of my career, but let me show you how that career started. I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana. I went to de jure segregated schools in Indianapolis public schools till the 5th grade. In 1978, I graduated from the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University with a degree in accounting. I graduated from Yale Law School in 1982. When I graduated from Yale, I came back to my home city of Indianapolis, Indiana to work for the most prestigious law firm in the state. When I did so, I became the second Black person, also the second person of color, to work at a law firm of any significant size in the state of Indiana. In 1987, when I joined the faculty of Indiana University Maurer School of Law, I became the third Black person, once again, the third person of color as well, to work as a faculty member at the law school that had, at that point, 150-year history. I'm the longest serving law professor of color in the history of the state of Indiana. And yes, I participated in those CRT meetings in 1989, as well as for the next 6 meetings. In 1991, I created the first race and law course in any law school in the state of Indiana. Now, as I said, I'm nearing the end of my academic career. So when I look back over my career, now I'm looking at it really almost as a completed thing. So I kind of know where all the parts fit together. And those early CRT meetings were without question the most significant academic experiences that I had. They molded the way that I have thought about race for 35 years. But the other thing about being 35 years removed from those original CRT meetings is that now we can look at history and we could see that the things that concerned us, that brought us together, the fear that we had, we turned out to be prophets because those concerns had manifested themselves in the past 35 years. I want to start with this as a definition of critical race theory, but don't worry if you don't get it now, because I'm going to flesh it out as I go through this. But critical race theory isn't so much a thing or a set of ideas as it is a framework, a way of looking at American society that helps us understand how race and racism continue to shape the meaning of racial inequality in our dominant culture, our concepts of equality laws, and our institutional, governmental, and private practices. As a result of not understanding this, our society continues to generate significant racial disparities in those important socioeconomic criteria, despite civil rights reforms of the 1950s and 1960s. I do need to give you a couple of warnings. Let me start with the first warning here. I'm going to ask you to think about race, racism, and racial oppression in ways that our mainstream society normally does not. After all, CRT is a criticism of the normal ways we think about racial oppression and racial discrimination. And we believe that the only way our society is going to overcome its persistent racial disparities in those important social and economic factors is by changing the way that we think about race. And in order to do that, we have to become conscious of the unconscious ways in which our thinking of race is being structured. I'll also say to keep in mind, we were law professors. Our lessons were therefore primarily intended for law professors, judges, lawyers, and law students. In other words, our intended audience were the people in our society who are responsible for the administration of justice. because fundamentally what we were making was a claim about justice. Now, since the beginning of CRT, when you looked at the Supreme Court and its rulings on race, in fact, not the beginnings of CRT, I think we can go all the way back to the 1970s to the appointment of 4 justices to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon during his first term. From that point until the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett in 2020, the breakdown in the Supreme Court on important racial issues was 5 conservatives and 4 liberals. So we always thought we were close to a fundamental change. Now, of course, it's 6-3, and that hope has receded into the past. But to make the point I'm saying about law clear, I need to say something about the importance of law. Because what law does for our society is it sort of sets the framework of what's possible in our society. The main point we were making in CRT as scholars is that changes in the law that were brought about by the United States Supreme Court brought our nation's progress towards racial equality to an end. Now, we all are familiar with the abortion debate, and it doesn't matter whether you are for a woman's right to choose or believe that the abortion is the killing of an innocent child. The point is that all Americans now realize that the decisions by the 9 members on the Supreme Court influence the rights that all of us have. And I also think it's likely that the Supreme Court is going to set off another firestorm this summer, probably in June, when it strikes down affirmative action. So when people talk about the system, what they are talking about is the legal system. This is the place where our society resolves all of its significant, important, major issues. So what it means then is that my job as a law professor isn't just to teach those who administer justice about our society, in our society, but it's also to try to influence the very system that people talk about when they talk about the system to make it more just. The original CRT participants included Asian Americans like Neil Gotanda and Maurer Matsuda. They also included the formidable Latinx scholar, Richard Delgado, as well as Trina Grillo. However, our thinking was dominated by the Black-white paradigm. You know, some 35 years, or almost 35 years after the original CRT meeting in Madison, Wisconsin, we can tell how large the Latinx community has become. But in 1989, the concept of a Latinx community was one that was still in flux. Some of us in this audience still remember when we didn't have a Latinx community, what we had were Cuban Americans, Mexican Americans, and Puerto Ricans. It's really not until the 1970s that American thinking coalesces around creating a Latinx community that includes all of those from Latin America. But at any rate, there was another important movement that came out of CRT, LatCrit movement in 1995, that addresses the issues related to the Latinx community. To understand CRT, and I mean to really understand CRT, what you have to do is go to where we were when we got together in 1989. And that is, we have to look at the racial disparities that existed in our society in 1989 when we came together. So what I'm going to say next, you have to understand that you don't understand anything about CRT. We were not worried about intentional, conscious racial discrimination. We were not worried about the Ku Klux Klan. We were not worried about the neo-Nazis. We were not worried about those segregationists who stood in the way of us going to universities or eat at lunchroom counters. We felt that the legal changes that had occurred during the civil rights era were sufficient to deal with that form of racism. What we worried about were the disparities in the important social economic statistics of our society. Now, that means I got to show you some stats. And I know sometimes when I show people's stats, a lot of times when I show people's stats, the eyes kind of glaze over, and that's kind of the end of the listening. So I'm imploring you to come with me here, and I'm going to show you some stats. But what I want you to think about before I show you the stats are the things that people think are important in their life, because that's what the stats are trying to show, are those aspects of our lives that people think are important. And what do people think are important in their lives? Their family, their job, including whether or not they're unemployed, where they live, including whether or not they own their own home, how much income they have, including making sure they have enough to be above the poverty rate, how much wealth they have, because this is vital. The wealth that you have allows you to pass that money on to your kids that gives them a head start in life. They're going to worry about their political power. They're going to worry about their educational credentials. People are going to worry about the possibility of being sucked into the criminal justice system. They're going to worry about their medical care. And of course, they're going to worry about their life expectancy. So what the stats are intended to show you are the racial disparities that exist in those factors that matter most to people. They show that people of color, especially Black people, are having a very different lived experience in the United States that is shaped by our country's past history of racial discrimination than non-Hispanic whites. It means that Black people in the society struggle more economically. They don't have the money for vacations in Europe, for tutors, or for SAT prep courses. They don't have the money to give their children a head start in life. They know family members and friends who have had terrible experiences with the criminal justice system. And they see people whose lives end earlier. And they stand by dumbfounded to watch white politicians talk about how CRT education hurts their children because they are demonstrating their obvious obliviousness to the suffering going on by Black kids in those very same institutions. Simply put, CRT was primarily concerned about the normalization of our racial disparities in the important social economic conditions of our society. That is, we were primarily motivated by the thought in dominant American society that Black people are supposed to have less. A second caveat for you is that I have to talk about history. I know that the basis of American culture is individual self-determination. That we determine who we are based on our own individual efforts. We preach this, we teach this, we sing about this. We'll even ask a 7-year-old kid, what do you want to be in life? Knowing that no 7-year-old kid could possibly have any clue. But that's how committed we are to the religion of individual self-determination. But this focus on individual self-determination carries with it a significant conceptual blind spot. Because if you are who you become because of your own efforts, what does history have to do with you? And that was the point of me trying to point out some of the stuff in my past. I don't become the second person of color to work at the Indianapolis office of a national accounting firm in 1978, or the second person of color to work at a law firm in the state of Indiana, or the third person of color to be on the faculty of Indiana University Maurer School of Law, or the first person to create a race and law class without talking about history. Those are not things that I did based on my individual ability. I was not the smartest Black person ever. It was because of the history of our society. So we recognize in CRT that self-determination is important, but we are also, all of us, products of the history of our society. Hence, CRT stresses the history of racial oppression and the struggle of Black people to overcome it, both the history of racial oppression and the struggle of Black people to overcome it. So to understand where we were, let us go back to 1989 and look at the socioeconomic statistics. Number one, school desegregation had peaked in 1981 at 37% of Black children in majority white schools. That's it. Given everything we did in our entire society, the maximum percentage of Black kids we ever got into predominantly white schools was 37%. And why that's important is because school desegregation was one of the principal programs of our society to attack the continuing racial disparities. Also in the 1980s, the number of Black males in prison increased by a staggering 220%. The homicide rate for Black males doubled in the 1980s. In 1976, there were 45.5% of the Black college students were males. By the time we got to 1990, they had dropped down to 36.7%. It's been a little lower than that for the last 35 years. Black family income throughout the 1970s stood pretty much at about 58% of white family income. In other words, we had to make $1 out of 58 cents. Black poverty rate remained at about 31%, which was about a 3.5 to 1 ratio of white poverty rate. There was a slight closing of the racial gap of Blacks with college degrees over the age of 25, but the ratio was still almost 2 to 1. And while Nancy Reagan was telling us just say no to drugs, Senator John Kerry was testifying in front of Congress about CIA involvement in crack cocaine winding up in Black communities. But you know, the problem was as bad as it was in the 1980s. In 1989, the 1990s were looking like they were going to be worse. Federal courts were terminating school desegregation decrees, so we knew we had already hit the maximum amount of school desegregation we were going to see in our lifetimes. In 1984, Ronald Reagan was reelected with 2/3 of the white vote, but only 9% of the Black vote. In 1988, his vice president, George Bush Sr., received 60% of the white vote and only 11% of the Black vote. That meant that the federal government was not going to be a friend of our struggle for equality. Black conservatives were criticizing affirmative action and talking about the declining significance of race. And commentators were arguing that Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. would have been against affirmative action because they took out of context a phrase in his I Have a Dream speech where he says, judge everyone by the content of their character than the color of their skin. But then finally, the US Supreme Court in 1998 delivered 5 major civil rights decisions, all of which cut back rights of minorities. The most significant raised questions about the constitutionality of affirmative action. Footnote, that effectively means we as CRT got together with a threat of the end of affirmative action, which we have been living with for the last 34 years. And those attacks on affirmative action, those were the most disconcerting for us at CRT. Keep this thought in mind. The 23 of us that met in Madison, Wisconsin in the summer of 1989 were either the only one or one of two persons of color in our predominantly white law school faculty. So think about what the end of affirmative action meant to us. It meant that we were never going to have additional colleagues of color joining us on the faculty. But if you looked at the students, there was a study done, released in 1991, that pointed out without affirmative action, 2/3 of Black law students in law school would not have been admitted to a single law school. So the end of affirmative action would have been devastating, not only for us in terms of being professors and not having more colleagues, but not having Black students either. So as you can see, we were highly motivated to figure out what had happened to America's march towards racial equality. So that everything I've said up to this point has really been a lead up to CRT. I haven't started to talk about it yet. It's really setting the background. But however, to talk about what happened on the road to equality, I really need to go back to 1954. It's in 1954 with the Supreme Court's decision of Brown versus Board of Education that everyone agrees is the start of the civil rights movement. Brown versus Board of Education was the decision by the Supreme Court that struck down segregation statutes that existed in 21 states throughout the country, covering 40% of the public school students. This is the Supreme Court case that when people talk about the pantheon of equality in American society, they talk about this case. And when you look at Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court had to answer a question there that it never answered before. Because in Brown versus Board of Education, the physical facilities and other material resources in the Black schools and the white schools were equal. So the court had to decide what is wrong with segregation when in fact you really have equality. Now it might seem obvious to us today, but that was not the case back in 1954. But before I go in and show you what the court said, I need to be fair to the court. And to be fair to the court means I've got to take us back to 1954 so we understand what the conditions were in American society in 1954. Because in 1954, people of African descent were called Negroes or colored out of respect. And we were called coon, darky, and even Black as an insult. Neither America nor her descendants from Africa had undergone the civil rights movement, the Black consciousness movement, the multicultural movement, the diversity movement, or the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement. The court's opinion in Brown versus Board of Education preceded by a decade the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which has been the most sweeping civil rights act in our country's history. It preceded by 11 years the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 gave our Black brothers and sisters the right to vote in the South for the first time in the 20th century. And after all, that's where a majority of Black people live. Discrimination on race, based in employment, merchandising stores, eating establishments, places of entertainment, hotels and motels, was a generally accepted fact of life. What in the 1980s would become known as the glass ceiling, in 1954 was a firmly implanted outright concrete barrier. The Supreme Court opinions in Brown, therefore, was certainly a major step forward in our road to racial equality. Indeed, I'd even say a giant leap, if you will, because striking down segregation statutes was certainly something very, very important. But keep in mind that the 9 justices, the 9 white males who delivered that opinion in 1954, were all born in the 1800s. So they could not escape the racism of their time. So if we read the court's opinion in Brown from the hindsight that now occurs 72 years later, we can see the reality that Brown versus Board of Education did not create the intellectual understandings for the desegregation era to bring us to racial equality. At best, it could only get us some ways down the road. So as I said, in Brown, the court had to address what was wrong with segregation, assuming that, knowing that the physical facilities and tangible resources were equal between the Black and white schools. This is what the Supreme Court wrote about the harm of segregation that then sets the basis for the entire desegregation era. The court wrote, to separate African American youth from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in ways unlikely ever to be undone. Segregation of white and colored children in the public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of the child to learn. Segregation with the sanction of law, therefore, has a tendency to retard the educational and mental development of Negro children. Now, let's just look at this so that we really understand what the court is saying. And indeed, as we look at this here, this is what reveals the limitations of the entire desegregation era. Because what the court says here is that segregation has only harmed the mental development of Negro children. They're the only ones harmed. And it's a form of retardation that may stick with one forever and is unlikely ever to be undone, which means Black adults are already hopelessly and irrevocably negatively impacted. And the solution to the problem is to move Black children into white spaces. Thus, what made Brown such a historic break with the racist attitudes of the past was not that it saw Black people as equal. It saw the source of our inequality in a deficit social environment and a deficit culture. Now, comparatively speaking, that's positive, because the earlier justifications were that the inequality was a result of a curse from God in our biology. So to say that it's in your social environment and your culture is at least optimistic enough to say there's something we can do about it. If it's biology or curse from God, there's nothing that you can do. But here's where the problem of race in America is today. This is where it's revealed. The court's opinion basically ignores the corrupting impact that history of slavery and segregation had on the racial beliefs of our entire society, including those of whites. If Black people were made to feel inferior, clearly whites would have suffered a psychological harm as well, and that would have been false feelings of superiority. The court's opinion also ignores the fact that our educational institutions, as well as our other institutions, would have been corrupted by the negative beliefs about Black people that segregation was based upon. When thinking about education, for example, the decisions to determine what materials to show to kids, who should teach those kids, how they should teach those kids, and how to administer that education, all would have been corrupted by the negative beliefs that segregation was built upon. But the court says nothing about that. The court assumes those weren't harms at all. Now, it's also important to note that the social scientists who filed a brief in Brown versus Board of Education pointing to the harm of segregation on Black kids also pointed to the harm of segregation on white kids. And this is what they said. Those children of the majority group who learn the prejudices of our society often develop patterns of guilt feelings, rationalizations, and other mechanisms which they must use in an attempt to protect themselves from recognizing the essential injustice of their unrealistic fears, hatreds of minority groups. And I want to highlight this rationalization because those rationalizations go on today. What do you think standardized tests are? All the standardized tests we look at, LSAT, MCAT, GRE, GMAT, OAT, DAT, all of them, we see these same significant racial gaps. Indeed, this is the reason that you think that the Black schools in St. Louis, or one of the reasons that the Black schools in St. Louis are viewed as terrible educational institutions because of the performance of the kids on the test. But let me provide you an alternative understanding of standardized tests. One that was provided by one of the justices on the Supreme Court who was in Brown versus Board of Education. He was talking about an affirmative action program at the University of Washington, the other University of Washington. Since the LSAT reflects on questions touching on cultural backgrounds, the admissions committee acted properly, in my view, in setting minority applications apart for separate processing. These minorities have cultural backgrounds that are vastly different from the dominant Caucasian. A test sensitively tuned for most applicants would be wide of the mark for most minorities. In 1960, let's see. At this, oh, yeah, I don't need to provide you that. So despite the fact that Brown was a significant step forward, it could not get us to that land of racial equality because the limitations of Brown were clear. The court assumed that the only harm of segregation was what it did to Black people. And indeed, as Justice Douglas would say in that same opinion, the years of slavery and segregation did more than retard the progress of Blacks. Even a greater wrong was done to whites by creating arrogance instead of humility and encouraging the growth of a superior race. And the beliefs of segregation impacted more than just the institutions of American society. However, by the time we get to the 1970s, the Supreme Court's rationale starts to change, and they start to move towards colorblindness. And colorblindness is the notion that the proper way to deal with racial and ethnic differences is to transcend them in order to deal with individuals as individuals. Now, colorblindness is a certain understanding of individualism. It's not the only understanding of individualism, but it has become the dominant understanding of individualism. It is an understanding that starts with the notion that privileges individual self-determination. And the idea is really pretty simple. Deep within of you is your quintessential self. And your goal in this life is to discover who you really are and then line up the aspects of your life out here so it is consistent with that deep quintessential self that you have. You can see how this idea comes from the concept of the soul in Christianity. So what people are supposed to do then is to discover who they are and line up their aspects in life so that they're consistent. Since this is the goal, the greatest obstacle to this goal is the notion that your ability to be self-determined becomes constrained by a characteristic you do not choose. Thus, things like race, ethnicity, gender, physical disabilities, sexual orientation need to be ignored so that individuals can become the kind of person their self-determination says they should be. With respect to racial and ethnic differences, you become colorblind. That is, you transcend, which means ignore the functioning of race. Now, I would say this right here is one of the principal breakthroughs that we had in CRT, and that was the understanding of the limitations of colorblindness. Now, let me first start. There's nothing wrong when you're dealing with someone as an individual being colorblind and starting as an individual. That's the only way you really get to know each other. So there's nothing wrong with that. And we weren't speaking about that. But when you're talking about using colorblindness to deal with things like legal, educational, economic, political, and social issues, colorblindness has a totally different impact. The first thing, colorblindness denies the lived experiences of people of color that are shaped by race. And this is why I started also with what happened to me. If you transcend race to get to know me, you don't know me. You know some abstract image that you are creating in your mind of me. Colorblindness also provides a very narrow definition of race. Race discrimination only exists when it is motivated by conscious intent to discriminate against someone because of their race. But the other forms of racism, unconscious racism, stereotyping, institutional, and cultural are all overlooked. The color consciousness of people of color becomes viewed as a form of racism. I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard, why do you have to have a Black Law Students Association or Black Lawyers Association? Because our consciousness is being viewed as racist. We're being viewed as the ones who are racist. Colorblindness, individuals object to being called a racist because this carries a moral condemnation, right? You never do this. If you call someone a racist, it's like dropping the atomic bomb on them. Colorblindness discounts the impact of history on the present. And if you discount the history on the present, then when you look at these racial disparities, you stigmatize people of color as the failures because history is underappreciated. Colorblindness institutionalizes the experience of the majority as the norm. This is the point that Justice Douglas was making about the LSAT. And taking race into account in order to remedy the present effects of the discriminatory past simply becomes another form of racism. Therefore, you can't do it. And not taking into account race to remedy the discriminatory effects of the past means that those racial disparities are frozen into place. And this then here becomes where we have to make our point, where I have to show we were prophets and not fools. What I'm going to show you then are some important socioeconomic statistics starting from 1960, because I think everyone agrees that means we're talking about segregation, to 2020. And here we go. Here's median family income. I mean, I think you can see how these two lines go in tandem. Here's another way to look at it in terms of percentages. Roughly 58% to 63% has been the way it's been for the last 60 years. Here's poverty rates, right? As poverty rates for whites go down, poverty rates for blacks go down. Here's the ratio. Almost always right around 3-to-1. Here's persons over the age of 25 with a college degree. Now, if I convert this to ratios, it looks a little better because more people are getting college degrees and therefore the ratio gets better, but the percentages stay about the same. Here's the unemployment rates. And here, once again, here's the percentages, or I'm sorry, the proportions. Here's home ownership. And here's Black home ownership. Now here's life expectancy. Life expectancy has actually gotten a little better. Let me see. Oh man, okay, you're lucky. This is the earlier draft. Actually had life expectancy for Black males, and if I put that up, you see that actually there's about a 7-year disparity between Black males and white males, meaning Black women have almost got to parity with white women, but Black males are far from that. Something I think virtually every Black male in here knows. Here's incarceration rates. And historically during slavery, Black people didn't go to jail. Here's family wealth. So as I said, our critique was of the Supreme Court and of Supreme Court decisions. And Supreme Court decisions undercut our society's march to equality. There was a 1978 opinion that rejected using quotas to determine admissions into medical schools. The University of California at Davis, right? A medical school saying, we have not admitted historically Black people. How should we do this? So they agreed that what they would do is the faculty is minorities are 16% of the population. Let's add 16% of the spots for them. And we don't want to harm whites, so we'll just increase the student body by 16%. That's how affirmative action started, not to harm whites, but to provide additional opportunities for people of color. The Supreme Court comes along and says that's unconstitutional. So rather than 10 to 12%, which would be proportional representation of Black people in medical schools, you end up with something like 4 to 6%. And if the court strikes down affirmative action, you can figure that 4 to 6% is going to go down to 2 to 3%. But just imagine how different our society would be if over the last 40 years, Black people had proportional representation and people graduate from medical schools, law schools, and MBA schools. I could go over this other, but I do want to move a little further, a little faster, to get you to the CRT position. The basic CR position is that we think American society has normalized racial disparities of people of color, especially Black people. And we believe that the creation of these racial disparities has resulted from the discriminatory past, which is being perpetuated. And this is a very important point to make. We believe, without question, that the dominant American cultural ideas are ideas that we all come up with. We're not talking about individuals and individual beliefs. We're talking about those dominant American cultural ideas that are socialized into all of us. Jesse Jackson tells this story about how he's at a bank machine, and when he hears something behind him and turns around and sees it's someone white, he feels relief. Because Jesse Jackson's saying what we're saying. It's all of us who are being influenced by these dominant ideas from our past. And those are the ideas that we are trying to stop. But to stop those, you have to be conscious of the unconscious way in which those ideas have a hold on us. We also argue that society needs race-conscious efforts in order to dismantle the institutional policies and practices that produce racial disparities. So we're looking for a race consciousness, not like the older race consciousness that was used to maintain racial oppression, but a race consciousness used to dismantle it. So CRT concepts are these: interest convergence and racial realism, which come from Derek Bell more than anyone else. This is the notion that Black people only progress when our interest converges with that of dominant elites. Now, of course, if that's true, then racial realism would be true, which would be racial subordination would be permanent in American society. White privilege, and white privilege is not to say that white people are going to have great lives and not going to have any troubles. I mean, you all know that. I know that. The white privilege is that whites have a privilege of not having to deal with America's history of racial discrimination. People of color do not have that privilege. White innocence comes from individualism. If I should only be responsible for me, then why should I have to pay for what someone did in the past? Quick analogy. I don't have any children in public schools. Why should I have to pay tax money to educate people in public schools? Somebody else's kids. And the answer is obvious. It's about our society. It's not about me as an individual taxpayer. The other problem that we point to is that colorblindness ignores unconscious racism and stereotypes, microaggressions and institutional racism, other forms of racism. We'll use the term minoritized people just to make the point. We weren't born minorities, we became minorities in this society. I mean, you think about the black people that came over here as slaves from Africa, they were from all different ethnic groups and different regions, spoke different languages with different religions. They became African Americans here. They didn't start that way. And then, of course, you need to discuss the history of American society, because if you don't talk about the history of racial oppression, people end up assuming that the problem is with the black people. Now, I want to do this really quick, and then I'll stop here. I looked at the Missouri bill, one that's there, and I thought I would quickly talk about some of the concepts to show how they do or do not fit with CRT. One race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex. This is not a CRT position. We never made this argument. It's never in anything that we've ever said, and it's totally inconsistent with our entire focus. The United States is fundamentally racist or sexist. Depends on what you mean by that. If what you, I know it may be, if what you mean are the American people, our answer is no. If what you mean is dominant American culture that is molding people to think in negative ways, then our answer would be yes. An individual, by virtue of his or her race or sex, is inherently racist or sexist or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. We know with respect to consciously, the answer would be no. That's not what we were worried about. Unconscious racism is certainly a part of CRT, so that would be inconsistent. That would be a problem for us. Excuse me. An individual should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or partly because of his race or sex. Of course, CRT supports this. We believe you have to have race-conscious measures in order to attack the racial disparities. Members of one race cannot avoid treating others differently with respect to race or sex. I have to say, I don't think I really know what that means. So I'm not really sure. So I'm just gonna say, I don't know, I'm taking a pass. An individual's moral character is necessarily determined by his or her race or sex. Clearly, this was never anything that we argued. An individual, by virtue of his or her race or sex, bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. Once again, this is not a provision of ours. We didn't argue this. We're talking about the fact that all of us are prisoners of a dominant culture that was created by our history of racial oppression that is molding all of us. This is a collective fight of all of us against the terrible ideas of the past. Any individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex. The one person that I have a statue of, and I actually have 3 different statues of, is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was a racist. To the core was a racist. In January of 1865, after he signed the Emancipation proclamation, after it's clear that the North is going to win that war, Abraham Lincoln is trying to cut a deal to send Black people out of the country. But Abraham Lincoln supported the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. If Abraham Lincoln doesn't support that 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery, it is very well possible that slavery would have been reinstituted after the Civil War. That's why I have this statute. It's not about people feeling guilty or not that's important. It's about what they do. If you fight against racial oppression, that's what matters. You don't have to be guilty to fight about it. You just have to recognize it's wrong. And then finally, meritocracy or traits such as hard work or ethic or racist or sexist, or were created by a particular race to oppress another. I think our position on that is really, we don't really believe it's possible to put together race-neutral meritocratic credentials. So it's not that we think it's created for a particular purpose. We just think you're pursuing a goal that's just unattainable. Now, the Missouri law included a couple of other things. Those 9 were all in the executive order signed by Donald Trump, and that's why I started with those. These other 2 are 2 which are just in Missouri, but they were not in Donald Trump's executive order that he signed back in September 2020. And they are to promote any form of race or sex stereotyping, including ascribing characteristics, traits, values, moral, ethic. And I'm really not sure. I have to say, both of these, I'm not 100% sure what it is Missouri's getting at. So I'm going to take a pass on both of those 2. Let me stop here. I could go on, but but you're not going to let me. So let me stop here. She's like, hey, wait. Okay, so let me stop so she can ask some questions.
Thank you, Kevin. I think we could listen much longer. Obviously, we had a number of questions that came in. Some of them you've answered. I'm going to choose this one first. Given that CRT is not currently being taught in K through 12 schools, why are lawmakers in Republican-controlled states, including Missouri, proposing legislation to limit the teaching of it? Doesn't this interfere with necessary discussion about race in America in the classrooms?
Well, first up, yes, it obviously does interfere with discussions about race and ethnicity in law in the classroom. You know, I mean, it's hard to talk about people's motives. What I can say, okay. So, can you hear?
Is it turned on?
Is it okay? Is it working? Can you hear? Okay. So I don't want to ascribe motives. What I will say is I think this is touching on something that's very scary for a lot of people in American society, and that's the browning of American society. If you start looking at those under the age of 18 right now, a majority of the people in America are people of color. That means this is a society that is on the verge of radical fundamental change. And I think there are a lot of people that are scared about that change. And I think the way they want to do it is to try to really close their eyes and act like it's not occurring.
Here's one. Obviously you went through the history, and this is, how do you explain CRT in simple terms to someone who immediately shuts down due to what they've been told by their media source?
When we got together in CRT, that was the first time law professors of color had gotten together to talk about race. Think about that. Here we are now 35 years later talking about the impact of the first time the law professors of color got together and talked about race. Okay, that means you have so much more information that has been produced, that this is just the very beginnings of all of this information that's coming at you. The genie is already out of the bottle. American society couldn't put this back in the bottle even if it wanted to. We are on the cusp of tremendous change because we've come to realize something we didn't know. And I'll say this too, as CRTs, we were in communication with feminists too. And we were all led into the academy with the notion women and people of color are going to come in and see the world the same way the white males did. And we came in and we said, we're seeing a different reality. The person who's feeling that way, I understand how they're feeling because that past is lost. If they're going to be ready for the future, they're going to have to be ready to deal with multiple perspectives, multiple cultures. I mean, think about it. If half of the kids under 18 are people of color and you can't deal with them, what does that mean your life's going to be like in the future? Because the people of color can deal with whites. We learn about whites. I mean, that's the one thing. And to any person of color, say, well, let me just tell you exactly how they think. But the other way around, do white kids learn about us? That's different.
Have you found an effective way to engage with people who are opposed to critical race theory and try to change their perceptions? So kind of a follow-up to that previous one.
Well, I will say I did work on Indiana. Our legislature tried to pass an anti-CRT bill, and we had a major conference, sit down, really debate and discussion about it. And the Indiana legislature ultimately decided not to do it. I think about the only way you can try to do it is sit down and have a conversation with someone, because I teach, right, I created class, I teach America's history of racial discrimination. I've done it for 35 years. Every year I discover more and more about how bad it was, you know. I mean, I don't think we understood just how deep this thing went. It was just recently, I'm learning about how Hitler and the Nazis are looking at the US to figure out what they should do and go, and some of the things the US does is too extreme for us. So I'm hoping that it's about revelation where people simply start to learn things. One of the things I always talk about is Ulysses S. Grant. And I always raise his name because most people have a negative view of Grant, that he was an honest person as a president. He was naive, the job was too big for him. He made a lot of mistakes. There were a lot of scandals in his administration. And then you go back and you find out that 1.5 million people came to Washington, D.C. for Grant's funeral. What American today, in fact, if you thought about our population today, it would mean you need 10 million people to come today to get to the same proportion. What American today would die? The 10 million Americans would go to their funeral. Now, I had one student said to me, well, Beyonce, okay. Okay, but my point is, the reason Grant had such a negative reputation is because all of the stuff that he did for Black people. Under Grant's administration, they reenact the Civil Rights Act of 1866. They enact the Voting Rights Act of 1870. Black males get the 15th Amendment under his administration. They enact the Enforcement Act of 1871 and the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. He uses the federal army to destroy the Ku Klux Klan in South Carolina. The Klan does not become a potent force after Grant destroys it again until the 1920s. Why does Grant have such a negative reputation? Because of what he did for Black people. But that's a part of the digging up of history that you have to do.
We have to end it there, at least in terms of your comments. Thank you so much, Kevin. Just a few closing comments. I'm gonna, Joe, if you could come down and get the slides up for me just very quickly in terms of what you want me to do. One is, first of all, obviously, thank you for attending this first in our series of our Inclusive Excellence Speaking Series. You should already have an evaluation in the email inbox that you used to register for today's event. So we ask you to please complete that because your feedback will really help us to improve our programming. As I mentioned earlier, we will have a reading and resource list related to critical race theory also that we can present to you. And did you want people to scan the evaluation? Okay.
Evaluation should be in there.
Okay. Giving you is pretty much what this conversation is. So
Thank you.
if you want it, it's got the charts in it and everything. Take a look at the article. It's about a 35, 40-page article.
And as follow-up to today's program, next week we will host a perspective session on critical race theory. If you want to stay engaged in this conversation, if you scan the QR code on the screen, you can go ahead and RSVP right now. During that discussion, we will obviously follow up with what Kevin discussed today, and also as follow-up to a discussion that we had during MLK Week. Next. If you want to stay connected with us, a different QR code. This is the way you can find out about different events that we have coming up. Again, we have a number of programs that are already in place. We'd love to stay in contact with you. And then finally, okay, sorry. I went too fast. I'm trying to wrap up very quickly, sorry. Okay, and then you'll be able to sign up for the listserv. This is the way you can get emails, and we also ask you to follow us on social media. And then finally, in terms of lunch, we do have lunch outside. What we ask is that if you are gluten-free or vegetarian, that you go first to get your lunches. And then we ask everyone else to go after that if you don't have those dietary restrictions. So ask you to just wait for a minute. And again, thank you so much for attending. Thank you for your attention. We appreciate you. Again, thank you, Kevin Brown, so much.